What is going on YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the third album by rap duo the Ying twins. Basically, this project is called Me and My Brother, and it came out in the late summer of 2003. So the thing about this particular project is just the fact that they had a hit single that was pretty large throughout the they had a pretty large single that was large in the second half of 2003, which was Salt Shaker. Pretty big deal about that particular song. Definitely, Lil Jon was red hot back in Lil Jon was red hot back in 2003, and Ying Yang Twins, similar to their 2005 album, The United State of Atlanta, had 4 singles on here, which is interesting just because for the most part, this album is widely known just for Salt Shaker, but it did have some other hit singles that were some pretty good follow-ups and precursor singles as far as that pitch can have. Definitely Naggin' is a pretty hit song. Definitely appreciate that one. Kind of an underappreciated Ying Yang Twin song, and I'd have to say What's Happening is another highlighted type hit that's kind of underappreciated as well. It's just kind of a good pitch about that. It's just kind of a good pitch about those songs in particular. I'd have to say Georgia Dome was kind of the fourth single that didn't quite chart as heavily, but it's still a decent follow-up. That's an almost song for me. I'd have to say within that relative pitch. But yeah, Ying Yang Twins were a pretty big deal throughout 2003. Crunk was really starting to blow up around 2003. Lil Jon was pretty ubiquitous throughout that year, 2003, 2004, beginning of 2005, 2002 especially as well. Is what I'd say. Lil Jon was a big deal, but he was starting to produce for other folks, get some other folks out there like Ying Yang Twins, Lil Scrappy, some of those type folks. Really, the reality of it is Ying Yang Twins. This is their third album, so they had been around since the year 2000. They'd had a number of hits back in those days as well, 2000, 2002, some of those type pitches. But basically, Salt Shaker was like oil and fire as far as that Basically, Salt Shaker was like oil and fire as far as that particular pitch can have. Just the combination of Lil Jon and Ying Yang Twins. Just the combination of Ying Yang Twins and Lil Jon was a pretty dynamite one. I'd have to say in particular, definitely extensively good. I'd have to say, but the concept about this particular album is this was a southern rap kind of pseudo classic. I'd have to say it's kind of haphazard nowadays. The album is kind of somewhat half baked and not quite. The album is somewhat half baked in particular. I'd have to say, minus like the club cuts on here. For the most part, these album cuts that are not club songs, this particularly kind of fall flat, and it's just kind of half-assed and not really fiery as far as that pitch can happen. But for 2003, this was extensive. I mean, for the most part, getting to the four singles a pretty excellent type. Getting to the four singles a pretty excellent type fare as far as that pitch can happen. They were a big deal 2003, 2004. Months after this album came out in September 2003, they made it to about the summer 2004, and then they dropped their hit album, United State of Atlanta, also, which was another big deal. So this is kind of the concept. Pretty much in a similar fashion to United State of Atlanta. They got 3 hit singles, and then the fourth one kind of flubbed a little bit, but it's just kind of the concept that at least they get to like the fourth single, which is not common for a ton of folks just around that particular time. Just kind of the concept. I mean, apart from like 50 Cent and Eminem, really Lil Jon did not get to the fourth single off of his albums from 2002 and 2004 as far as that pitch can happen. So it's just a big deal. Ying Yang Twins were kind of a front runner for Southern hip hop around in 2003. Definitely, this is before T.I. was like a full blown kind of household name, stuff like that. Lil Flip was kind of taking it off here and just stuff like that. So there weren't a ton of folks apart from 36 Mafia and David Banner and some of those type folks, just would have to say. But yeah, they're from Atlanta, stuff like that. So it's definitely some ATL type stuff. I like that Killer Mike was on here. I like that Trick Daddy and Bone Crusher were on here, some of those type folks. It is kind of a sin that there weren't more Lil Jon beats on here. I mean, Salt Shaker is such a good song. Just the fact that there weren't any other Lil Jon beats, especially with him in his prime, it definitely should have been. There should have been at least one other one. It probably would have wound up being a single, but it's just kind of the concept that they definitely could have used another Lil Jon beat, something like that. They did manage to get to the fourth single without him. It's just kind of the concept. Salt Shaker is easily like the best song on the album, I'd have to say. But the other 2 hit singles are at least pretty good as well, I'd have to suppose. So this is a pretty quality album. Like I said, it's kind of a pseudo kind of southern classic, just within the sense of at least having some hit singles, good kind of club life, and just overall good, compelling type of appeal out of 2003 before things really started to shift as far as that pitch can happen. Just a real pretty rock solid southern rap album, I'd have to say. Just the concept. I mean, it's half baked, but it's just kind of the concept for the time. There weren't a ton of folks really doing what Ying Yang Twins was kind of doing around summer 2003. So it's just kind of the pitch. Obviously, Bone Crusher was kind of one hit wonder. Rick Ross wasn't aware. Bone Crusher was kind of a one-hit wonder. Killer Mike wasn't full-blown around yet. Rick Ross wasn't around quite yet. Just some folks like that, just in particular. So Southern rap was kind of blossoming around this particular time. Lil Jon was blowing up, but he hadn't really had like 3 or 4 or 5 hit albums to his name. So this is kind of the concept. It's just an interesting pitch. I do appreciate this album, despite the fact that my appreciation for it's probably higher than the score I'm going to give it. I still would have to say this is a pretty decently solid enough album, despite its kind of haphazardness. I'd have to say. But we'll go ahead and talk about the singles here. Basically, like I was saying, there's 4 of them. So the first single is Naggin'. This is a pretty nice song. This is probably the second best song on the album, I'd have to say. I like this song more than I like What's Happening, I'd have to say. Pretty good pitch for that. It's like a malaise kind of dreary nightclub noise of a song, I'd have to say in particular. It's like a good unwind tune after like a bad day, I would have to suppose. Pretty good concept for that. And this is just kind of a get crunk but kind of preoccupied type song, I'd have to say in particular. And this is just a pretty dope one. So I definitely like the chorus on this one. It's pretty close to Salt Shaker. Just the energy is a little bit different. It's a little bit more preoccupied. Once again, if you had like a bad day, something like that, if women are kind of pissing you off, some of those type pitches, ladies, those type pitches, just kind of getting into arguments and bickering, bass pissing you off, some of those type pitches, it's just a good song to kind of go unwind at a club and have a beer or something like that. Have a scotch, some of those type pitches as far as that particular kind of happens. Just a good concept. I mean, it's kind of a dance song, but it's just kind of the concept. Strip club noise, some stuff like that. But it's just kind of the concept of just kind of being preoccupied and a little bit in a muddled mood as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. But it is a nice one. Real hooky type song. Really works as one of the better Ying Twin songs out of this. Naggin' really works as one of the better Ying Twin songs out of the early 2000s. So I'd have to say in particular, that's a nice one. Salt Shaker is the second single. This is pretty much like a 2000s era classic. I'd have to say this is like a classic kind of nightclub banger. I'd have to say in particular, this is hooky and raucous too. The song is hooky and raucous in particular. I'd have to say a pretty good concept for that, just to get that particular pitch. This is like a 2000s. This song is definitely like a 2000s highlight. I'd have to say in particular, definitely a decade. Definitely a decade highlight, I'd have to say in particular. And this is just a crunk ready little John beat, I'd have to say, and the vibes. And this is just a crunk ready little John beat and vibes, I'd have to say about this particular song. So it's a pretty good pitch. Once again, it is a sin that there aren't more little John beats on this particular album, just like that one. Lil Jon, I think they probably did that on purpose, just because they probably realized that this was going to be a hit and they didn't want to rely overly on Lil Jon, kind of use him as a crutch as far as that pitch can happen. But this continues to be one of Ying Yang Twins' biggest songs. This was a huge deal back in the fall of 2003, early 2004, pitches like that. This just made songs like this made Lil Jon pretty ubiquitous around that particular soundscape as far as that particular kind of happened. Just some good concepts that he just had the Midas touch back in those days. But Ying Yang Twins do a great job with this particular song. The noise that they do on that song is just very catchy and infectious. Just some stuff like that. Just some real excellent type noise. This is a pretty much nightclub classic that you can still hear today, 20 years later, and still appreciate it quite a bit, I'd have to say. What's Happening is the third single. This is another highlight one. This is like a solid follow-up to Salt Shaker, I'd have to say in particular. It's like a classic kind of rowdy crunk noise. This is like some classic kind of rowdy crunk noise, I'd have to say in particular. And the turn-up vibes on this song are pretty edgy and red hot, I'd have to say in particular. So this is one. What's Happening is probably a pretty underappreciated Ying Yang Twin song, I'd have to say in particular. Just a good concept to get that one in particular. It's not every day that you hear this particular song. I mean, obviously you're going to hear Salt Shaker, but this is actually a pretty boisterous type one to kind of get just within the edginess of it in particular. This is definitely a rowdy type one. This is definitely some classic stand on the couch, get rowdy type pitch as far as that particular kind of goes along with it. Just some real, this one has less ladies in mind just with this particular song, a little bit more for like the dogs and a little bit more for your dogs and pitches like that as far as that particular kind of goes. But it is a pretty good follow-up. I mean, this is a surprise hit. This is the sort of stuff that separated Ying Yang Twins back in those days, just because on their 2003 and 2005 albums, they were able to get to the fourth single, and 3 of them charted pretty well. This is actually like a top 30 single. What's Happening? It's a pretty good pitch to get that one in particular. Second biggest song off the album, even though I like Naggin' more, I'd say What's Happening was a pretty big deal just within that relative pitch. It was a good follow-up to kind of get them a little bit more stability as far as that pitch can happen. It's just a nice one, but yeah. And then Georgia Dome was the fourth single. This is an almost song for me. Like I was saying, I do like this song, but not as full blown. This is like a decent kind of night venue energy, I'd have to say in particular. It's like a good later on type music, not one of the initial type ones, but pretty much when the energy starts getting lazier and pitches like that, when it's like midnight, 1:30 in the morning, some of those type pitches, when you're paying less attention to like the background noise, this is just a nice one to mellow out and smoke to, I'd have to say in particular. And this is just like some vanilla crunk, I'd have to say. It's a decent concept. The beat is somewhat grating. That's kind of the reason why. It's just kind of a vanilla type. Georgia Dome is just kind of a basic type one in pitch and execution, I'd have to suppose in particular. It's a good, nice one to kind of have for like some nightclub type energy. Most of these songs are meant for the nightclub in terms of the singles as far as that pitch kind of goes, but it's just kind of the concept that just doesn't have the thrills. The execution in terms of thrills is just not as high on this particular song, but it's still one I halfway recommend, I'd have to say. So in terms, basically out of 12 songs in this particular album, there's 14 songs in this album, but minus 2 skits or intros as far as that pitch kind of happens. There's 12 songs on here, and out of those 12, I wound up recommending to you 6.5. So I'd have to say out of those, so I'll go ahead and recommend those 6.5 songs. So they would be Naggin', Salt Shaker, What's Happening, What the Fuck, Grey Goose, and the almost song is Georgia Dome. So talk about some of these highlighted type ones. Basically, Grey Goose is a pretty nice one. This is like a crazy red cup type music, I'd have to say, to get swamped to in particular. It's a pretty nice highlight to get that in particular as far as that pitch kind of goes. It's like some excellent bar hopping type music, I'd have to say, just in particular as far as that. This is definitely some excellent bar hopping music. I'd have to say, in particular, good pitch to get that. And this has a vanilla. The song has a vanilla beat, but it's pretty turned up. I'd have to say, so it's a good pitch. It's definitely one to get crazy to as far as that pitch kind of goes. The lyrics on this particular song are pretty exhilarating. This is the concept of getting fucked up off a Grey Goose and some pitches like that. Just real crazy type factor as far as that particular kind of goes. Great song to get cranked to. Great pairing with Salt Shaker, a little bit of nagging in there, some of those type pitches. I'd say What's Happening is kind of a crazy type one, despite the fact that it's not as much like a smokish type tune. It's more of like a gnarled crunk type tune. But Grey Goose and Salt Shaker are probably the two craziest songs on this particular album. Hands, pretty nice one, but I feel like Grey Goose and Salt Shaker are probably the two craziest type ones. Those are the best ones to kind of get for just some gnarled. Those are the best two ones to get for like some gnarled type times, I'd have to say. But What the Fuck is a pretty nice one. This kind of has some revved up kind of energy, I'd have to say, just in particular. This has Killer Mike and Bone Crusher on there, which is an interesting pitch and good concepts for that. It's like a solid. What the Fuck is like a vanilla 2000s nightclub bopper, I'd have to say, in particular. It's like a good posse cut, I would definitely have to say, and it's like a riveting kind of dance noise, I'd have to say. Pretty good concept for that, and it's like a typical kind of out on the town type tune. So What the Fuck just works within that basic kind of pitch. It's a vanilla type song, but it is good for like some vanilla type noise, just in particular as far as. So What the Fuck works in like a vanilla type sense. This is basically like a filler type song, I'd have to say, but it's kind of, the song is basically like a filler type song, but it's filler in a good way, just as far as that pitch kind of happens. It's just nightclub filler as far as that pitch kind of goes. Not really like the 10 out of 10 thrills of like Salt Shaker and a little bit of Grey Goose and especially Nagging and What's Happening, some of those type ones, but definitely if you got some nightclub noise and you just want more Ying Twins, if it's a little bit more custom made for like the playlist of stepping out as far as that pitch kind of goes, this is just another good highlight to kind of have for like some nightclub type noise to kind of zone out to as far as that kind of goes. It's a vanilla type one. Hands a pretty nice one. This is like a good entry kind of initial club kickoff noise of a song, I'd have to say in particular. It's like good for some regular evening turn up, I'd have to say in particular. The song is exhilarating and engaging, I'd have to say. The song just has some exhilarating and engaging energy about it in particular, I'd have to say. So it's a pretty nice one. Basically a pretty entry type one, just like the concept of this one. It's a little bit one to kind of have just as the dap getting is just initially, just kind of the initial kind of dap and stuff like that, the congregating, fraternizing as far as that pitch kind of happens. Just an initial type one. Obviously, Salt Shaker would be more something for like 9:30, 10:30 p.m. It's like pitch, that's just like pitch of the night. And I definitely say Nagging's kind of one to kind of just, that one's probably something I would play after Has you start getting the drinks in your system, some of those type pitches. And What's Happening is easy, like the follow up the Salt Shaker when it's like midnight, something like that. Just a real, probably one of the crazier songs, at least for 2003, 2004, I'd have to say. But it's a good concept. So I just would have to say those are some good pitches. And Georgia Dome is just kind of like about midnight type pitch, just within the same pitch as like Salt Shaker, just not as catchy, I'd have to say, but it's just kind of the concept. But to basically talk about some of these songs I don't recommend on here, there's just a lot of assortments of like crummy productions on here that just don't add up to much. I just kind of feel like some of these, especially when they're not in the nightclub and pitches like that, I mean, they do have some vanilla club type songs for album cuts and some great singles on here in particular, but just the concept, some of these type ones like Calling All Zones, Me and My Brother, Hard, some of those type ones, they just kind of fall flat in terms of song composition, overall execution, just production fare as far as that pitch kind of goes. They're just not really thrilling as far as that kind of goes. Just some lagging type moments. Nagging part two, the answer is kind of a poor type one. I mean, I like the aspect of having a woman's answer for like the nagging type song. Nagging is just basically bitching about women as far as that kind of goes. But nagging part two is basically like the female's answer, just the retort as far as that particular kind of goes for slacking men as far as that particular kind of goes. But it's just kind of a concept. Not too commonly I would listen to that one, I'd have to say. Is kind of the concept. The first nagging, the single nagging, the original nagging is pretty highlight type one. Just kind of get within that pitch. Just kind of works for that. Sometimes there'll be answer type songs to like female and male oriented type atmospheres, but this is just kind of one where the answer was just not quite as responsive or engaging as far as that kind of went. But Armageddon was another poor type one. Some of these were just kind of does in terms of the arrangements and just the aspects behind them. So it's just kind of concept. So I would say me recommending 6.5 songs out of 12 on this particular album. I'm gonna go ahead and give this album like a 6.25 out of 10. Like I definitely feel like this is kind of a pseudo classic album just within the execution of it in terms of the singles and the widespread appeal and the lastability and the replayability of some of these type songs, especially in like the nightclub sense and the three main singles as far as that pitch can goes. It's just kind of the concept that it's haphazard besides like the singles. There is some vanilla album cut noise in terms of nightclub type appeal, but for the most part, this is a pretty flat album. In terms of album cut appeal, I'd have to suppose in particular. It's just kind of the concept about it, but I would still feel like it's a pseudo classic. Revolutionary for 2003 was a big deal around that particular time. Had some ubiquitous songs on here. It was definitely a lot of casual appeal. The social score, speaking of which, I'm going to go ahead and give the social score like an 8 out of 10 because I feel like the appeal of this particular project is pretty large. It does have some of that casual type appeal, I'd have to say in particular. It's just a good concept. The 4 singles were a good look, definitely within that pitch. The Lil Jon song was a big The Lil Jon song was a good look just within that relative pitch. So it was a pretty, so this album was a pretty big casual, big deal. I'd have to say in particular. So it's a good enough pitch to kind of get that just within that relative fold. Just really has some great stuff for outings and social appeal as far as that pitch kind of went along with this. So 8 social. In terms of the future, like Ying Twins hasn't been up to much in recent times. I want to say that they've at least dropped an album like in 2020, 2021, something of that relative pitch. They dropped mixtapes up until at least 2013, 2014. So they have a number of projects. I'm definitely going to get to some more of these. This is a pretty boisterous album. Like I was saying, it's a pseudo classic, just in terms of impact, casual appeal, nightclub appeal, stuff like that, just in particular. But it falls flat with most of the album cuts on here. But I would still have to say it's a big deal enough to kind of warrant a purchase and stuff like that. But it is somewhat haphazard, I'd say. But I do recommend it. So yeah.